Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my 2024 mid-year check-in slash freakout tag. So this tag should probably be familiar for a lot of people perusing booktube as this video is present, because a lot of people do versions of this tag in June. It's very fun. I myself have mashed together a bunch of questions from a few sources. I have lots of attributions to leave down below, and I even created my own question that I answer in this tag. I have a lot of fun. I have a book haul, I guess you could call it, that, goes all the way down here of books to talk about. So let's get into it. So the first question on my list is, how many books have I read so far in 2024? And the answer as of today is 53 books. And I've done a lot of time feeling iffy about that answer. Like, in my best of best worlds, it would be great to read 10 books a month, but obviously that hasn't happened, and I'm now officially trying to get myself into the stage of that doesn't matter. I just need to enjoy my reading. I mean, obviously there are books that I do hope to get to this year. I'll be talking about them in this tag, but I'm going to try to keep it as easy as I possibly can and not worry too much about the numbers. So there we go. And the best book I've read in the first half of 2024, I think I have to give to Joy Comes in the Morning by Jonathan Rosen. Maybe in part because I've been waiting for a book like this for so long, that talks about Judaism from a progressive religious experience. Not only is this book about that, but I feel like the characters really pop, and so they talk about, religious ritual and, spiritual questions about life and death and all of that from this particular vantage point. And so much of, Jewish stereotypes are either like ultra-Orthodox or like Seinfeld sort of, secularism. So it's just really nice to get this perspective that feels a lot more personally close to home. The best sequel I've read so far this year is Blade of Dream by Daniel Abraham. I'm just really enjoying this world, especially this sequel. I feel like he picked characters from his city of Kithamar who have interesting backgrounds and an interesting quest together, and I just really like how this fantasy city is building up, and it even reminded me of a fantasy city that someone in my beta reading group has in his novel, and I suggested this book to him as a comp, or this series to him as a comp, and he is using it in his query letters, so that makes me pretty excited. And I'm excited to see where this fantasy series will take us next. For favorite short story collection, I have The Witchblade and Other Stories by Suzanne Feldman. I would even put this as my favorite cover, perhaps, of the year, except I technically got it last year, and it's from a local press, the Washington Writers Publishing House. I get those words out of order sometimes, but anyway, in a way, I feel kind of iffy about using this. It is technically a collection of short stories centering around the art scene in Baltimore, but there are also a couple of novellas, and one of them in particular hit close to me. But there are short stories in it as well. For my most read genre of 2024, I actually, did a little tally on this Post-it paper, and from the tags I use on Goodreads, I've read the most fiction, 18 books of fiction. And when I say fiction, what I mean is that it's a catch-all term for adult fiction that doesn't fit into short stories, sci-fi or fantasy, or anything that I deem Jewish themed, which I have its own section for. I have to say, I think reading fiction for the BookTube Prize quarterfinals, which I don't usually do, helped get that number up. For new releases you want to read, I usually shame myself in this category with books I own that came out in 2024 and I haven't read yet. And in that case, the book I have to show you is Relics of Ruin by Aaron M. Evans. It is another fantasy sequel in a world that's based off of archival materials and elemental magic that's related to that, and I am looking forward to getting to this. And another book that came out this year I haven't read yet and I don't own, but I feel like I should put in here, is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, because just a few weeks ago the librarian at my synagogue announced that will be our next in-person reading option together. And The Familiar is also fantasy, but it's based off of the Jewish experience in the Inquisition. And I am on the holds list at my library for the audiobook, and I'm very hopeful that it will come to me before September. We'll have to see. For most anticipated releases of the second half of the year, I kind of went all out this year. I found a lot of things that really caught my fancy, more than I'm even going to mention here. I figured I had to ultimately cut it down. But back in January for my anticipated reads for the first half of the year, I chose 9 books, so I decided to go with 9 for this half of the year as well. So I'll go in what I assume is still chronological order, unless, you know, publishers change dates or whatever. But here we go. The first thing coming out is Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. This is literary fiction, Jewish-inspired, about a failing New York family, I believe. I really loved her first book, Fleischman is in Trouble. This one's also getting a lot of buzz. It might even get an adaptation like Fleischman did, so I'm very excited. Next, I have The Mercy of the Gods by James S.A. Corey. Also so excited for this because I read their series The Expanse. I absolutely loved it. The adaptation is probably one of my favorite TV shows of all time. I also thought the books were really great. I think this is going to be similar but different. It is sci-fi, but it's less, I think, science-based than The Expanse is, and a little more fantastic. But, you know, I like how they do characters. I like the issues they come up with, so we're going to give it a go. In a similar vein, we have The Gods Below by Andrea Stewart, where gods come into the title, but this is fantasy fiction. And again, I'm turning to this author because I liked her last fantasy book series, and I thought, well, let's just jump on to the next one and see what she does next. Next, I have Song for the Brokenhearted by Ayelet Sabari, which I just found out about recently, and I'm very excited. I've read Ayelet Sabari's short story collection, and I've read her memoir, and this is her first novel. I think a lot of them have very similar themes about her Yemeni Jewish upbringing in Israel, and that should be a starting point for this novel as well. Back into fantasy, we have A Dark and Drowning Tide by Alison Saft, which is being billed as adult fantasy. I'm not quite sure. I've read her YA fantasy. It does not necessarily sound that different from it. I've actually only read one of her YA fantasies, though, which, like this one, also has Jewish inspiration behind it, and I have a penchant to go after fantasy with Jewish inspiration. And speaking of which, that now we have Night Owls by A.R. Vishny, which I found out about when Hey Alma unveiled the cover of this book, because Hey Alma's a Jewish media site, and Vishny is a writer, or has been a writer for that site, so they did her unveiling. And this book is also fantasy, and it deals with Jewish vampires. It's an element of, I guess, our mythology that I'm not quite as familiar with, but I'm very intrigued to see where this goes. And sticking with Jewish-inspired fantasy, what can I say? I have my niche. Next, I have The Republic of Salt by Ariel Kaplan, which is a sequel to a novel that came out last year, which is also Inquisition-based fantasy, except it's about a portal world. And we're going to go see what's coming up next in that story. And similarly with Our Deadly Designs by Kaylin Josephson, the only difference here is that this is YA fantasy rather than adult fantasy, but again, there's a lot of Jewish inspiration behind some of her world building. It takes place in a secondary world filled with horse racing and political intrigue, and also golems and things like that. And finally, to get away from the Jewish-inspired, but to stick still with fantasy, I have The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri, which I think should be the conclusion of her fantasy trilogy that takes place in a world that's based off of Indian mythology. So I do like, you know, secondary worlds that are kind of based off of real myths and culture and that sort of thing. It's been a little while since I've read this series, but hoping for the best to, you know, wrap it up. Okay, next question takes us off of that high a little bit because it's the biggest disappointment of the year so far, and I'm going to have to go with Day by Michael Cunningham. I remember last year at this time, I just recently found out about this book being published, and I was so excited. and I think I let the hype get way too high with this one. I mean, I'm kind of touch and go with Cunningham. There are a couple of his books that I really loved and a couple that didn't work for me so well, but I jumped into this one, and this was one that didn't work for me as well. It's just too fragmented a novel. It's one of those things where, like, it takes place in 3 timelines, the following characters for half a day or a quarter of a day for 3 consecutive years. It goes through COVID in part, and I just feel like the characters didn't have enough time to breathe or become real to me, and I was just disappointed with how it turned out. And as a runner-up in this category, I'm going to mention The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. This was my first foray into her novel-length fiction. I've read and enjoyed some of her short stories, but this one just didn't work for me. I read it for the BookTube prize. It was beautiful writing, but again, the characterization and the themes were just too one-dimensional for me. The biggest surprise, I'm going to stay with the BookTube prize for this one because the first one I want to mention is The House of Doors by Thanh Tuan Eng, which I guess it was fortunate for me that I went into this as blind as I could. I liked it a very cursory and ultimately rather inaccurate perusal of the cover copy and decided just to go in blind from there, and it turned out to be quite different than I expected, and I was just so tickled pink that I mean, not only was it a surprise, but it was a very welcome surprise, and it introduced me to the world of W. Somerset Maugham, who was a famous British writer during colonialism, and he ends up being a character in this book, and Eng ends up, retelling some of the tales that he told when he was, gathering stories from Asia, from the colonial expats who lived there. And I just thought it was beautifully written, it was clever, it had interesting things to say, and it was just a look at a certain, aspect of life and history I wasn't as familiar with, and I was just so pleased with this. And in a similar fashion, I have Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. Again, I only briefly perused, the cover copy before starting to read. I had a little more of an understanding of what this book was about, but not entirely. And it was much deeper and much more thought-provoking about themes of money and power and personal responsibility, and it had a thriller aspect to it, and it had some overlays of Macbeth, and so it was really a treat. For favorite new author, I'm going to go with Jonathan Rosen. I mentioned his book Joy Comes in the Morning as my favorite book of the year so far. I actually first read him again for the BookTube prize this year. I read The Best Minds, which is his sprawling memoir. It's not his best, I don't think. I mean, it's interesting. I read this and I knew I wouldn't vote for it to advance in the BookTube prize, but I was still very intrigued by mostly his upbringing and his Jewish background, and I saw then that he wrote other books, and I wanted to give them a go. So another one I recently read is his essay collection, The Talmud and the Internet, much more slight, which is about him coming to terms with his legacy as the grandson and son of Holocaust survivors on one side, and then Jews who lived in relative security during that time in the US, and then also he digs a little into what the Talmud means and similarities into what the internet is now. And, for somebody who's kind of too knee-deep in Jewish religious thought, this could be quite charming. Yeah, I'll have to keep an eye out because I think he'll keep writing, hopefully, about Jewish themes that intrigue me. Next, I have Newest Fictional Crush, which is the question I decided to adapt a bit for my own purposes. And I decided instead I would ask myself, what is my favorite relationship that I've read about this year? So the first one I'm going to talk about is Gaunt and Elwood, an In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This is a World War II era novel that follows the trajectory of 2 English schoolboys who are in love with each other as they sign up and fight in World War I. And it's just harrowing and beautiful about who they were to each other and how that relationship changes based off of the horrors they see and just what they emotionally experience together. I'm going to say as an honorable mention, Moishe and Shona from the Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. They are the Jewish couple from that book that takes place mostly in 1930s in a small suburb in Pennsylvania that's slowly becoming more, segregated, that the white people are moving out and only the black people are remaining. But Shona in particular wants to stay with the community she grew up in and has just a really strong ethic about, reaching out to help people. And Moishe, supports her, and he is able to find his own way, also creating like music venues for the black people. And they're just, it's a story overall about, the underdogs coming together, and Moshe and Shona are very much at the center of that. For newest favorite character, I'm going to go with Rabbi Deborah in Joy Comes in the Morning. I just absolutely loved her. She was so irreverent. She's everything I think I'd want a rabbi to be if I knew somebody, ultra personally myself, and that, she has a deep commitment to her faith and into helping people, but she's also not perfect, and she knows that. And she has, her own, likes and dislikes about Jewish law and how she practices it. It's especially interesting because the Reform movement and how, their evolving relationship with Jewish practice. I thought she was just so quirky and jumped off the page. And as an honorable mention, I'm going to go with Bunny from Mobility by Lydia Kiesling. I really was intrigued by this book, which kind of follows the oil business as told from the perspective of a young woman, my age, I'll say young, sure, as she finds herself coming in sideways into this industry, starting as a executive assistant, and then learning more about it, and it ultimately starts questioning like her own culpability in what the oil business is doing to the planet and to certain populations. And I just thought it was a really compelling book, and her characterization just felt so real, like flawed, but also three-dimensional. For a book that made you cry, I'm going to have to return to In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, just because it's about the horrors of World War I and what a massive, gory graveyard it was. And if you got out with, at least a beating heart and maybe some of your limbs, you still had the shell shock and the trauma from all of that. Perhaps related to that, another book I'm going to say made me cry. I mean, a lot of books make me cry, but it certainly made me the saddest is Judgment in Tokyo by Gary J. Bass, which I read for the BookTube Prize, and it deals in a nonfiction setting about the Tokyo trial after World War II, which was supposed to be the thing that would end all wars and hold all nations accountable. But, not only is it depressing because obviously that didn't happen, but also just the ways that the trial itself was so flawed and the hypocrisies of it, and how it was too big of a task and everyone was too biased to, I guess, really do this subject matter if it can be done justice, which it probably can't be. It couldn't be done justice, just the horrors we inflicted on each other in these world wars. But for books that made me happy, I'm going to start with Bookish People by Susan Cole, because it's just so delightful. It's, the sprightly, mainstream, upmarket fiction that occasionally I do read when I, get off my depressing literary bent. It takes place in a bookstore. There are some, deeper questions about, standing up against bigotry and the questions of cancel culture today and how that fits into the literary landscape. But mostly it is just a charming setting of an indie bookstore and the people who inhabit that space and how they're able to come together to create a community, and it's very, very charming. And as an honorary mention, I'm going to go with Well Met, Renaissance Fairs, and the American Counterculture by Rachel Lee Rubin. Technically speaking, I wish this was a little less dry and academic in its presentation, but it is about love of Renfests, and I love Renfests, and my own Renfest, the one I go to, the Maryland Renfest, is big enough that it features very prominently in here, and it was just such a squeeze, a hug of being reminded of its brilliance. I know there's an HBO special that was on recently about, I think, the dysfunction of the Texas Renaissance Festival, but that's not what this book is about. For my favorite review or booktube video, I'm going to go back to a video I make in February where I review short story collections. This year I actually went for 2 collections where I recently had short stories published myself. So I was so tickled, and I felt so wonderful to read the other stories in these collections and feel part of those communities. It was just a really lovely time. For the best book to film adaptation of the year, I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about his Dark Materials Season 3, which technically came out a few years ago, but I recently did a rewatch, and I just feel really close to this particular season in my heart. A lot of it is doing some heavy lifting with inspiring my own fantasy series that I'm writing. And I just love the questions that Pullman is asking and who he decides to be the main character and why. And honestly, for a while I was in a little bit of a dry spot with movies and TV that were really speaking to me. Earlier this year I did watch Three Body Problems Season 1, which I very much enjoyed. And now I'm watching House of the Dragon Season 2, which frankly speaking I do think this will be a favorite of the year. We're a few episodes in and I'm pretty hooked. So there we go. For the most beautiful cover I bought this year, I'm going with Relics of Ruin by Erin M. Evans again. I think I just love this sort of thing, how busy this cover is, how it's like looking at an actual table that's filled with actual artifacts and other things. I just love it. For my next big priority in my reading, I don't know, there's so many things. I make so many plans in advance, it's kind of crazy, but starting maybe with Victober, I hope to return to reading more Elizabeth Gaskell. Then for Sci-Fi September, I'm going to try Israeli author Eyal Kless. And for Women in Translation Month, I'm thinking Italian writer Silvia Avallone. And then in July, I am debating some fiction and nonfiction about the Rothschild women. In terms of my bookish highlight, I might have to go with choosing my maybe mid-Rosh reading list thanks to the BookTube Prize Octafinals. Again, it was because I read this book by Jonathan Rosen for the BookTube Prize Octafinals that I decided to get around to reading these two books also by Jonathan Rosen, which I enjoyed even more. So I'm really kind of thrilled how that turned out and how you find, new authors through this whole endeavor. But I tend to mention both the BookTube Prize and maybe mid-Rosh a lot on this channel. And I also feel like I can't let a yearly check-in video of some kind go by without mentioning my reread of A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, which technically, yes, I read in November, not this year. I read it just before the adaptation came out in theaters, but oh boy, it was just so special to read this book again and to reacquaint myself with all of the things that challenged me when I read it when it first came out and the new ways, and then I've learned to look at things and the way she frames these issues of propaganda and vengeance and authoritarianism, it just really grips me. And finally, my last question is, what books do I have to read before the end of the year? And I'm going to first start with The Faithless by C.L. Clarke. This is another fantasy sequel that was on my anticipated reads list of 2023. And in fact, I've had it out so long from the library, and I've just been kicking it down the road of my TBRs that I had to return it and recheck it out. So I really do just want to get it off the docket already, and I expect to be starting it very soon. And another 2023 anticipated release that I haven't gotten to yet is Roman Stories by Jhumpa Lahiri. Lahiri is technically one of my favorite writers, although her switch into writing Italian fiction hasn't been the best. I feel like she's lost a lot of the nuance because she hasn't, it's not her first language, but I hear slightly better things about this collection, so I'm kind of hopeful, and I just feel like I have to give her a go anyway. And that about covers it for me now. I will be leaving Goodreads links and reviews and YouTube videos all listed down below if I talked about them here. It's always fun to get to the end of this tag and think about how much I actually have been reading and thinking about and enjoying and experiencing this half year, and how much can be waiting for me hopefully in the next half year of 2024. Possibly not so much fun to think about editing this video, but what can you do? You can expect to see me back on this channel hopefully in the very near future as I do my spring quarterly wrap-up with my writing goals, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.